Thanks for taking the time to be here today. My name is Brian Fishman. I'm a counterterrorism research fellow here with the New America Foundation. And I'm going to make this intro as short as possible so we can get to the meat of the conversation. I really appreciate all of you being here. At New America, we like to have as much of a dialogue during these kinds of events as possible. So when we get to the Q&A period, please, you are invited to speak. When you do so, wait for the mic and announce your name and affiliation, and I'll remind you of these sort of general guidelines going forward. We're here to hear from Farley Mesko and Tom Wallace of the Center for Advanced Defense Studies, C4ADS, today, which has done a fascinating report on Russian arms smuggling via a port in the Ukraine. They're going to go through that. I'm not going to touch the meat of it here immediately, but what I will say is in the interest of full disclosure, I first became aware of C4ADS and the work that they're doing here through my work with the philanthropy team at a company called Palantir Technologies, which has donated to C4ADS, and they used that analytical software in their work here. And that should be on the table. We in Washington, I think, don't often make those disclosures, and we always should in the interest of transparency. So with that said, I am going to turn the mic over to Farley. He's going to introduce their work. Tom will come up, and Farley will close, and then we'll move on to Q&A. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Brian. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming, and thank you especially to New America for hosting us, and to Bailey for putting this all together. This has been a really fascinating project, and we're really excited to have the opportunity to sort of share our results and have this discussion today. The business of arms transfers, and particularly those originating in the former Soviet Union, is complex, it's convoluted, it's deliberately opaque. And, further, many of the customers of these countries are states with poor human rights records, active conflicts or international sanctions, although I will state that we're not here to make any type of moral judgments one way or another. We fully recognize that, you could make the argument that the U.S. does many similar types of things. So, while these strategic or humanitarian sort of implications are often widely discussed, there seems to be a critical, in our mind, knowledge gap, at least in the public sphere, as to how these transfers actually occur. So, in simplest terms, the goal of this project is to explain how Russian and Ukrainian weapons get from point A to point B. And the answer to this question, at least according to our research, is a group of key facilitators that we term the Odessa Network due to many of the key sort of nodes and entities being located in Odessa, Ukraine. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes covering the investigative side of the project. As Brian said, Tom will then come up and talk about the analytical findings and some of the higher level implications. And then we're going to spend some time on Syria throughout, although again I'll state that the main focus of this report is not Syria. And we'll hit it again at the end. And then we'll close with sort of a discussion of the aftermath of the report, some possible areas for future research that we think would be productive. So the investigation. We began looking into arms transfers in November 2012. We were finishing up a project looking at kind of the maritime transport of illicit conflict goods out of East Africa to the Gulf. This was an industry that was and continues to fund Shabab, who unfortunately is again in the news this week. We were looking at the maritime private security companies, some of whom are Ukrainian, that were mentioned in the same UN reports that covered these sort of sanctions violations or conflict good, this trade in conflict goods. We started noticing similar names popping up in the open source reports of Russian arms shipments that had been sort of exposed, if you will, on the way to Syria. So ultimately we wanted to figure out who these people were and these companies and why they were involved in everything from private counter-piracy efforts in Somalia to facilitating weapons shipments to the Assad regime. And so began 10 months of sometimes exhilarating, but more frequently, soul-crushing analytical work. The investigation took us to multiple continents, many different countries, working across several languages, using a mix of shipping data, court records, corporate documents, as well as some on-the-ground interviews, some social media. And I want to say that we found ourselves relying heavily on a great community of investigators, analysts, and journalists that were looking at these issues of proliferation and arms transfers. And we made liberal use of databases and guides published by the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, the Investigative Dashboard, and the Ohwegan database of scraped Panamanian business records. The goal was to be as data-driven as possible in our treatment of this issue, as it is obviously a sensitive topic, but really at a macro level to explore the capabilities and the limitations of open source data in allowing us to sort of penetrate such an opaque system as this business. So, to start at the beginning, the first step was really to build sort of a functional model of the way that this works, right? Identify all the moving parts. What needs to happen at each stage for an arms transfer to occur? This is everything from who owns the weapons to who provides political cover to who provides the banking services that these companies use. It took us quite a while. It took us many iterations to perfect this model, and I stress it is not perfect at all. But we used it as sort of a template, as a heuristic to guide our data collection efforts, to identify knowledge gaps, and so forth. But one of our key insights right off the bat was that the vast majority of weapons transfers take place by sea on commercial ships. This is especially true for heavy weapons, for complex systems. And so we decided to focus our sort of investigative energy there. And our first data collection effort was quite simply to identify as many Russian and Ukrainian arms shipments or arms transfers as possible over a given period, which in our case was basically the Putin era. We used the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute database of arms transfers as a starting point, as a reference. We sort of cross-referenced these shipments with, or these high-level reports of shipments, the variety of supplementary sources. We used, just as one example, we used EXIF metadata from images that were posted by Venezuelan military bloggers, Cambodian activists, opposition activists, of arms shipments arriving in their countries. We looked at the dates, the times, the locations, and we used these to identify the specific ships involved in the transfers, which is not necessarily public information. We collected data from legal disputes in the Russian court system between Rosobronexport, the Russian state-owned arms export enterprise, and some of its contractors that referred to specific weapons shipments. And as an aside, I'll say that though data is imperfect in this regard, we also compared these sort of local news articles, the image data that we saw, these pieces of evidence showing that a ship was in a particular port at a particular time delivering weapons to the ship's publicly available transponder records that ostensibly track its voyages. And we did note discrepancies and patterns of discrepancies. So once we were confident that we had a reasonably representative data set of arms transfers, including the ports of origin, the transshipment points, the customers, the ships involved, we sort of set about the task of determining the real ownership of these vessels. Now, the sort of first layer of ownership and management of vessels in the maritime industry is not at all hard to track. But we know that the maritime industry in general, and the weapons business in particular, rely on sort of subsidiaries, shells, cutouts, in some cases to mitigate legal liability, obviously perfectly legal, but in other cases to sort of obscure ownership and create space to conduct sensitive transactions without attribution. So we had to rely heavily on Russian, Ukrainian, Panamanian business records, legal exhibits from court cases in these countries, SWIFT records, bank statements, to trace the real ownership. And At this point, I'll say that the data is nearly all open source, but it's not necessarily obvious or easy to find. And even where there wasn't always an overt paper trail between entities, though, we were often able to draw links based on sort of shared utilization of unique identifiers. And what I mean by this is if I dial a phone number with a country code sort of anywhere in the world, it's going to go to the same entity or group of entities utilizing that phone number. The same is true for an email address or a URL, and all of these things are listed on incorporation documents and business directories. We found a high percentage of dual listed personnel between the companies in our investigation, a high percentage of co-managed ships. And we sort of compared these networks and these connections to our original model. We evaluated the strength of our links and whether this sort of made sense in the context of our larger investigation. It was very much an iterative process, sort of over and over again until we were reasonably confident we were approaching an accurate picture of reality. And I'll say at this point that none of this would have been possible without Palantir. So thank you if you're here. And OK, so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Tom for a more in-depth discussion of our findings and sort of the implications thereof.
Preemptive hydration. As Farley said, I'm Tom. I'm going to be talking more about some more of the in-depth analysis that went into this. I'll grab this. So let's get into it. So one of the most important insights of our project is that there's strong governmental control over major weapons exports in Russia and Ukraine. So out of the 40-plus weapons shipment events in our data set, which spans from about 2000 to the present day, and covers everything from bullets to Uganda to kilo attack submarines to China, all of these have, all but two, have been able to be traced back to the Russian or Ukrainian governments. And I should clarify how we're able to say that. We determine this either through direct evidence, i.e. cargo manifests that say Rosoboronexport, which is the Russian state weapons export agency, or Ukrspetsexport, which is the Ukrainian state weapons export agency, or indirectly by cross-referencing with known state-to-state weapons transfers. In all these cases, the government owns the weapons, the government decides who to sell the weapons to, and the government decides who will transport the weapons from point A to point B, which is where this network of facilitators, which I'll be talking about, comes in. So this strong governmental control has a number of important implications. One of them is that it contradicts what I call the Lord of War hypothesis, after the excellent Nicolas Cage movie. If you haven't seen it, in which case you live a culturally impoverished life, it paints a picture of Russian, Ukrainian arms exports as essentially a free-for-all, outside of government control. Shady businessmen looting stockpiles, sending major weapon systems to the highest bidder overseas in bush planes and whatnot. And our data shows that this is really not the case. As I said, virtually all weapon shipments that we looked at could be traced back to the state. And this should be very comforting in a lot of reasons. The scenario I just described of things beyond governmental control is sort of the non-proliferation nightmare. You have no idea where those weapons are going. So a really important point is that this network of facilitators that we're going to look at are private companies that are logistics contractors for the government. They are not private arms dealers. So an important consequence of this is that these ostensibly private entities are in fact trusted to carry out some very sensitive foreign policy maneuvers. And I think that a case study can help show this. So since 2005, Russia has exported somewhere around $8 billion worth of weapons to Venezuela, primarily when it was still under Chavez when he was alive. This has included some pretty major weapon systems, such as the S-300 anti-air missile system, which is one of the best in the world, and one of the few that can reliably detect and kill US stealth planes. So all of these weapons that have gone from Russia to Venezuela, they have not gone on Russian warships. They have not gone on Russian government-owned cargo ships. They've been carried by private companies that are used by Russia to send weapons abroad. So this sort of public-private collaboration has some interesting implications. The fact that Moscow would hand over some of its best equipment to a group of ostensibly private citizens indicates they have a very high level of trust and communication with them. If you think about it, you're taking literally billions of dollars worth of very advanced military equipment, putting it in a ship, and watching it sail across the horizon and hoping it goes where it's supposed to. So this leads us to hypothesize that there are personal ties between this network of private facilitators and the Kremlin. As I'll cover later, our research shows that this is exactly the case. So now it's time to look at who these facilitators are. It's primarily a small group of shipping companies, primarily based in the Ukraine and EU, that carries out these weapon transportation events. So we term this the Odessa Network because many of the key leaders are based in Odessa, but this is very transnational. There are firms in Germany, there are firms in the Netherlands, all of which have transported Russian and or Ukrainian weapons over the past 10 years. So different elements of the network appear to have different functional specialties. For example, the Ukrainian firms seem to specialize in sort of A to Z logistics integration, while the German firms appear to specialize in primarily heavy lift, which is particularly large, bulky cargo like tanks or armored personnel carriers. So Odessa Network firms are not just weapons transporters. They have very diverse, legitimate business operations ranging from owning ships to operating ships, crewing ships, chartering ships, which is where you match a cargo owner with a ship and so that they can move their stuff for them. They have offices and personnel in places like St. Petersburg, Hamburg, Dubai, Singapore, and East Africa. So we've named just two of the more prominent facilitators in our weapons shipment data set. Kalbai Group is a Ukraine-based company, or more accurately, a connection of companies under a common ownership structure. That's the single most active transporter of Russian and Ukrainian weapons in our data set over the past 10 years. So just a short list of events to which Kalbai has committed. It's in the early 2000s, it sent cruise missiles to Iran and China. Also in the early 2000s, it sent assault rifles and night vision goggles and some other stuff to Angola. Just more recently, it sent Russian missiles to Venezuela. And recently, as you might have seen, the Washington Post published an article on our story, which we highlighted that some Kalbai ships have been going to Syria. The company denies that it has delivered weapons to Syria. I want to make that clear, but they did say that they have delivered so-called dual-use cargo to Assad during the course of the civil war. If you're not familiar with what dual-use means, that means something which has both legitimate civilian and military purposes. So for example, radar would be a dual-use weapon, or high explosives would be a dual-use weapon, dual-use cargo. High explosives could be dual-use cargo. So they've admitted to that. Brisa is, there's a second part of the name, Schifffahrts, I don't speak German, that also is a very active transport of Russian and Ukrainian weapons. So a short list of events it's participated in is military cargo to the Democratic Republic of Congo, tanks to Sudan, and armored personnel carriers to Cambodia. There are several other important companies that regularly transport Russian and Ukrainian weapons. You can read about them in our report. But I just want to stress that we're not making any legal or moral accusations, as Farley said. We're just trying to explain what happened and leave the judgment part up to other people. So these companies are an essential tool in sort of the Russian-Ukrainian foreign policy playbook. Arms exports are both commercially and strategically important for both of these countries. So the legacy of the Soviet Union means there are entire towns in both Russia and Ukraine which are essentially kept afloat by the big defense factory or the big tank factory or something like that. And so if domestic demand cannot sustain these, which it can't, then arms exports have a very important, legitimate domestic economic meaning. But then there's also strategy involved. So a lot of people have said that, oh, when Russia sells arms abroad, it's for the money, which may be true, I don't know. But the fact that they've essentially given the weapons away to a number of countries, for example, Venezuela, Russia gave them a loan to buy Russian weapons, so really no net transfer there. It's safe to say that they're doing so with geostrategic or political goals in mind. So if we accept that, then these ostensibly private entities are indirectly contributing to how foreign policy is made in Russia and Ukraine. So as I said, we should expect that these companies that we've mentioned have personal connections to organs of state power in Russia and Ukraine, both to establish trust, to communicate, to facilitate payment, all the things that you need to talk about when you're moving billions of dollars of sensitive cargo from point A to point B. These facilitators are also highly connected to each other. This is important to know because the Odessa Network is not a hierarchical or unitary organization. There is no smoke-filled cabal of people meeting, or if there is, I don't know about it. It's a group of linked companies and people who come together to collaborate on weapons shipments. They're legally distinct entities, but they're connected by family, business, personal, and educational ties. So this was sort of the grist for our social network analysis mill. So for example, a prominent Odessa businessman who has regularly transported Ukrainian weapons also has a brother, also based in Odessa, who also owns the shipping company, which also transports weapons. For another example, Kalbai, the Ukrainian firm I just mentioned a slide ago, has a British Virgin Islands registered subsidiary through which has offices in both Hamburg and Odessa that it uses as a vehicle to contract Russian weapon shipping contracts out to EU firms, including Brisa, the German company that I just mentioned. So the next place to look is these connections to the state. And as I said, we expected to find them, but I wasn't sure we expected to find quite so many of them. One of the most obvious ones is that one of the co-founders of Kalbai Shipping is a former deputy minister of transportation in Ukraine. Another co-founder of Kalbai and current, according to our information, current 100% controller, also sits on the board of a company called RT Logistica. RT Logistica is a Russian majority state-owned military logistics company. You may remember their name from last October when they were implicated in chartering a Syrian Airbus carrying radar and missile components to Assad, at which point it was intercepted by a Turkish fighter over, I forgot the name of it, Turkey. I was looking for the city name, extra credit. So through this connection, and I should add that RT Logistica is owned by a state holding company called Rostec or Russian Technologies, depending on how you translate it, which is a state holding firm which controls the vast majority of the Russian defense industry. And so through this connection, the co-founder and current owner of Kalbai regularly interacts with some of the most powerful defense industrial figures in Russia. This goes up as high as the current Deputy Director General at Russian Technologies, in addition to the Director of Logistics for Rosoboronexport. So the guy at the official state Russian weapons export agency who determines how weapons are going to go overseas. Most interestingly, a former senior executive at an Odessa Network firm I haven't named went on to become Russian Minister of Transportation from 2004 to 2012. And as you can see from this picture, is currently a personal advisor to Vladimir Putin. We believe the fact that the most active transporters of Russian and Ukrainian weapons are also the most politically connected is not a coincidence. We believe that there is a direct link between the two, that these are the pathways along which information and trust flow between the state and the private companies that it uses to facilitate weapons transfers. So far, we've covered the who component of weapons transportation, the companies and government officials who make this happen. And it's time to look at the where. So by far the most common port of origin for both Russian and Ukrainian weapons transfers is Oktyabrsk, which is located on the Black Sea in Ukraine. And it's important to note how we know this. So we see it both from cargo manifests, a document from a shipment that says this military cargo was delivered to some endpoint from Oktyabrsk. We know this from internal Rosoboronexport documents, which were released they're publicly available in the Russian court system, which specify procedures by which it says our normal thing is to move weapons from Russia overseas through Oktyabrsk. We know this from local media reporting both in Ukraine and abroad that will show pictures of ships being loaded with weapons at Oktyabrsk. And then lastly, it makes sense given the history of Oktyabrsk. So Oktyabrsk was specially built by the Soviet Union to ship weapons. That was its purpose for being. For example, when the Soviet Union shipped missiles to Cuba in, what was it, 63, triggering the Cuban Missile Crisis, this was the point of origin for many of those missiles. So consequently, Oktyabrsk has very specialized infrastructure that makes it particularly well suited for weapons transfers. It has everything from special explosive storage facilities, sort of segregating them so if one bit explodes, it doesn't turn the entire thing into dust, to heavy rail lines that connect it to defense factories all across Ukraine and Russia. The end result of all this is although Oktyabrsk is located in Ukraine, it is very frequently used for Russian arms exports, in addition to Ukrainian arms exports. And Moscow also appears to have sort of powerful indirect influence through key personnel. So for example, the port manager at Oktyabrsk is a former career Russian Navy captain. The oligarch who is reputed to own Oktyabrsk has been linked to the Kremlin in Ukrainian media. And then, interestingly, both of those two figures I just named, the port operator and the alleged owner, both were Russian citizens for the majority of their lives and only received Ukrainian citizenship quite recently through high-level political intervention, such as the president personally granting them citizenship. So Farley and I took a little field trip to Oktyabrsk a few weeks ago to take some pictures and just see what this was like. And I apologize, this might be a bit grainy, but I'll just point out a few things. So you can see the port is actually quite small compared to larger ports such as Odessa or Oktyabrsk. It's very secure, it's very isolated. There's what I term a privacy forest. I don't know what the correct term would be, but a man-made forest that sort of shuts it off from the rest of the surrounding area. There are multiple guard towers all over the point. There's a single entrance which is guarded, and all cars that enter it are searched. And just you can see the heavy rail and storage facilities over there. So overall, it's very well set up for weapons exports, which is its purpose. So while we're on the topic of Oktyabrsk, we're going to veer to Syria a little bit. So one of the main assumptions of our entire report was that when Russia and Ukraine sell weapons to some foreign customer, it is Russia or Ukraine who arranges the transportation. And as far as we know, our data set shows this to 100% be true. Every time that weapons were exported, it was Russia or Ukraine moving them. But it's certainly not impossible and not mutually exclusive that in some cases, foreign purchasers may arrange logistics, not Russia or Ukraine. So this is particularly interesting looking at Oktyabrsk because there's shipping records from AIS transponders, which is essentially a satellite system showing where particular ships are going, show an unusually high number of Syrian-owned ships calling at Oktyabrsk compared to other generally busier Ukrainian ports. Many of these ships are directly owned by the Syrian government or by known affiliates of the Odessa Network, i.e. companies that have an established track record of transporting Russian and Ukrainian weapons. Lastly, many of these ships are certified to carry dangerous goods. In order to carry weapons or explosives, you have to be registered and have to have certain safety permits, and an unusually large amount of those ships with those certifications are transiting this port. Now, I want to be perfectly clear, this is not proof of any weapons transportation. We notice it as an interesting anomaly that deserves further investigation. Ukraine is a large grain producer. Syria buys a lot of grain. This may have a completely innocuous explanation for why there's been an uptick in Syrian ships going to Oktyabrsk. Moreover, in the interest of fairness, I'd like to note that the Ukrainian government has said that Ukrainian weapons are, I think Representative is here, so correct me if I'm wrong on saying this, but that there have been no Russian weapons going to Syria through Oktyabrsk. And you can correct me on my wording later. But so they have denied this. But I'd also like to note that the larger point of Russian weapons going through Ukraine to places other than Syria, to the many countries all over the world that Russia sells weapons, have not been denied. So we're just emphasizing this as a point that we hope people can investigate further and introduce some more clarity to the situation. So at this point, we have the basic functional model of how Russia and Ukraine export weapons. State weapons export agencies own and control the weapons. They send them by rail to Oktyabrsk, where Ukrainian or EU firms load them up and move them to the foreign purchaser. So it's worth fleshing out, though, with what we call the support services. And you can think of this as the people facilitating the facilitators. So one of them is Latvian banks. It appears that a fair amount of senior Odessa Network leaders use Latvian banks. And we've established this through SWIFT records, through personal interviews, and the like. And it's worth noting, and I'd like to clarify, I'm not talking about any banks in particular, simply talking about the Latvian banking industry writ large, has consistently been accused of money laundering. Latvia is situated right next to Russia, and it's also a member of the EU, which means that money fleeing former Soviet republics, if it gets to Latvian banks, it can easily be moved to places like London or Switzerland. And so unfortunately, this has resulted in repeated allegations of money laundering, both from the EU, specifically regarding the Magnitsky case, if you're familiar with it. And it's even gone so far as that multiple Latvian banks were blacklisted under the US Patriot Act by the US Treasury Department in, I believe, 2005. So that's sort of the financial side of it. Another side of it is more legal and organizational. We know that some Odessa Network companies use shell companies set up by the same anonymous proxy director ring as Hezbollah, North Korea, and the Sinaloa cartel. So if you're not familiar with it, and I hope you are not, a proxy director is when you find a person and use their identity, either willingly or unwillingly, to register a company, typically in an offshore haven like the Cayman Islands or the British Virgin Islands. So someone else, some random citizen's name is listed as controlling this company, but in fact you are controlling it, just not through the paperwork. And so to be clear, there's nothing inherently illegal about having anonymous companies registered in the British Virgin Islands or somewhere like that. But the fact that the Odessa Network repeatedly uses this very specific ring, very specific operation that's been used by highly illicit groups such as I mentioned, Hezbollah, North Korea, the Sinaloa cartel, Vietnamese organized crime, Russian organized crime, that they're using that specific network, indicates to us this may be an attempt to deny attribution. Lastly, we know that there are private maritime security companies that are staffed by former Soviet Union military and intelligence veterans that are both used and owned by some Odessa Network companies to guard sensitive shipments. So this appears to be a response to a 2008 incident in which Somali pirates hijacked a Ukrainian ship carrying Ukrainian tanks and military cargo to South Sudan, which this was the Faina incident, if you're familiar with it. So since then, we've seen an uptick in the number of Odessa Network firms using private military security companies to guard them against pirate attacks. And interestingly, the largest private security firm used by the Odessa Network is owned by the same Russian shipping company that owned the Chariot, which was a ship which was interdicted in Cyprus in 2012, delivering weapons to Assad. So the same entity appears to have a financial stake in both weapons transportation and private military security companies. Oh, and just as an interesting note, a senior executive in the private maritime security company I just listed is a former KGB officer who came up in Leningrad in the 1980s and was stationed in East Germany, which is interesting. So at this point, I've hit you with a lot of granular detail about how Russian and Ukrainian arms exports work. So it's time to step back and say, well, what can I do with this? Why is this important? So the most obvious is arms control, is tracking weapons flows. So Russia is the second largest arms exporter in the world. It exported about $18 billion worth of weapons in 2012 to over 50 countries. Ukraine is a little bit smaller, but still the 10th largest weapons exporter in the world. Unfortunately, as Farley previously said, Russia in particular is quite opaque about saying where its weapons are going. And this is quite concerning, considering that their end destinations often are of a lot of interest to the international community. So if you look at this map here, And if you, for humanitarian reasons or policy reasons or economic reasons or really almost anything, have an interest in what's happening in these countries, then you can follow the facilitators I mentioned in order to get a better understanding of how Russian and Ukrainian weapons may be flowing into those countries. You can look at our report. We list all the companies that we know have moved Russian and Ukrainian weapons. You can look at port records for your country of interest. They're most of the time freely available on AIS websites, and compare the two. That is by no means proof that Russian and Ukrainian weapons are going to the country, but you might want to check it out. Second is conflict prevention, is understanding and isolating enablers. So some of the Odessa Network firms that are responsible for shipping weapons to customers like Omar Bashir in Sudan and the Myanmar junta also have active contracts with U.S. Military Sea Lift Command. We hope that people can use this information to make better decisions about who they do business with. For Russia watchers, the Odessa Network provides a detailed case study of sort of how the foreign policy sausage is made. So people often talk in abstract about some big picture themes of the 2000s in Russia and Ukraine. Restoration of state control over strategic assets. Links between the Kremlin and Kiev and private entities. Use of these entities for foreign policy purposes. Projection of Russian power and influence into its neighboring post-Soviet states. So it's one thing to talk about these in abstract. It's another to look at the Odessa Network and understand exactly how that happens. We find it very revealing from a big picture perspective. For Syria watchers, understanding the processes by which Russia ships weapons overseas in general could help identify how it ships weapons to Syria specifically. We think this is an area that deserves further research. From a diplomatic perspective, Ukraine's relationship with Russia has been frequently criticized in the West in the context of its bid for EU membership and uneasiness both with the EU and the United States about the nature of that relationship. So we've noted that a very high percentage of Russian weapons exports appear to go through the territory of Ukraine on Ukrainian ships owned by Ukrainian companies. The Ukrainian government has said these weapons are not going to Syria, and I believe them. But it has not denied that the overall flow of arms from Russia going to many different customers across the globe is going through Oktyabrsk, which is located in Ukraine. So we by no means have a perfect understanding of this situation, but we hope that our imperfect research can help shed some light on this previously poorly understood relationship and lead to more productive dialogue about it. And last, I'd like to note what uses our report doesn't have. In particular, we make absolutely no claims about whether Russia is particularly unique or bad or evil or whatever term you want to use for sending weapons overseas. The US is the largest arms exporter in the world, as is France, as is the UK. Well, they're not the largest, but very large weapons exporters. So we're not trying to isolate these countries as somehow bad with a capital B. We also make no claims about the relative culpability of Russia in arming the Syrian conflict as compared to other entities that are sending weapons there, such as US allies in the Gulf. Lastly, we also make no claims of what US policy should be regarding Syria and Russia. The purpose of this report was simply to describe in the most empirical terms possible how this works. And then we leave it up to you with all your diverse interests to interpret it and use it as you see best. And with that, I'll hand it off to Farley. Thanks.
All right. So I know we've hit you with a lot of granular information here, but I want to finish up with just a few minutes on sort of the aftermath of the project. The reaction around the world to the publication of this report have been particularly fascinating, particularly in the countries that we discuss, the East European countries that we discuss. We originally intended this report to be our sort of meager contribution to this community of investigators and analysts and journalists that are looking at these topics, the ones that I mentioned earlier. We are a small, relatively new shop, and at this time last year, we were far more concerned with keeping the lights on than with managing the public fallout of a report like this. But within a day of publication, there were camera crews, Ukrainian camera crews set up outside Oktyabrsk, filming all the trains going in. They were interviewing guards. They were harassing the port manager on the phone. And I'll say, like, many of whom denied that weapons even go through this port. So this has become a real sort of topic of interest among the Ukrainian public, particularly the half of the Ukrainian public that is ethnically Ukrainian, and sees this as representative of, Ukraine's perceived willingness to cave to Russia, especially on issues like foreign policy. We've had denunciations from the highest levels of Ukrainian government, including, as Tom said, the Minister of Foreign Affairs himself. We've had threatened lawsuits. We've had threatened lawsuits from their DC lobbyists to some of these companies, some of whom may be in the audience today. So I hope we have a productive discussion there. But all in all, so the swiftness and the extent of the reaction to this report has been enormously vindicating for us. I mean, it suggests that we're really on the right track with this line of investigation. And it's also been great to see this sort of investigative thread picked up by the Ukrainian and former Soviet journalists who have a much better understanding of this environment than we do, and just an absolutely reckless disregard for their own personal safety. So we're really excited to see what they come up with as they sort of work these issues. But ultimately, the goal was always to just bring a little bit of transparency to what has otherwise been an opaque but really truly strategically important industry. So in that, I think we have succeeded so far. So where do we go from here? There are a few possible investigative angles that sort of surfaced throughout the course of this project that we think would be interesting and productive to follow up on, particularly if any of you in the room are interested in contributing feedback or helping us kind of pull on these threads a little bit more. And so I'll start with Syria because we're under no illusions that that is the sort of key issue right now, and we'll sort of abstract out from there. As Tom mentioned, the Syrian General Authority, which is the Syrian government ship owner, has multiple ships, 2 heavy lift ships and 1 bulk carrier going back and forth between Oktyabrsk and ports in Syria. These ships were previously owned by large-scale weapons transporters based in Germany. They are both outfitted to carry dangerous cargo, including ammunition, weapons, explosives, dual-use cargo. Again, none of this is a smoking gun. We are just saying that it's potentially worthy of further investigation. Second, and on the same topic, as we sit here right now, there is at least 1 ship owned by a known affiliate of the Odessa Network, a known Syrian affiliate of the Odessa Network, unloading cargo in Tartus, according to its publicly available AIS records. The ship is also certified to carry dangerous cargo in bulk, as are the others that I mentioned before. This company has at least 1 other ship that's been making this trip from Oktyabrsk to Syria multiple times over the last 18 months. So again, no smoking gun. We just think it's worthy of further investigation. Third, and on a similar topic, I guess, we saw traces of Iranian signature over the course of the Syria component of this investigation. And what I mean by that is, for example, high percentage or sort of an abnormally high number of Tanzanian flagged vessels calling at Syrian ports right at the same time that Reuters, I believe, broke a story that Iran had shifted its preferred flag of convenience to Tanzania. Again, we think it's worthy potentially of further investigation, as it could potentially reveal patterns about how Iran is evading sanctions, particularly in its very strategically important maritime industry. And then finally, just to close, outside the context of Syria, we think that this methodology is extensible to other types of public-private collaboration in the former Soviet Union, particularly Russia. And particularly public-private collaboration in the foreign policy space, such as the export of strategic resources or nuclear technology. And so, as I said, please do get in touch with us if you have feedback, if you have comments, if you have advice, or you want to sort of help out as we decide where to go from here. And just finally, in conclusion, as I said, the ultimate goal here was never to implicate any entity in illegal or even illicit activity. Indeed, the vast majority of the transfers that we examine are perfectly legal. We were never searching for gotcha moments. The vast majority of these events were documented publicly. However, we think that we've provided a bit of granular information to help, penetrate this opaque and deliberately opaque industry. So if you haven't had the chance, please do go to our website, c4ads.org, read the report. We really hope we can have a productive discussion here today, and we welcome your feedback. And just finally, thank you all again for coming. Right.
All right, guys. Thank you very much. That is fascinating. The amount of, I'm sure I'm not the only one in the room sort of feeling like my hair has been blown back with a lot of data. So I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative first and ask a couple of questions. My first question is sort of about that data and what kinds of bias may be in the data itself. You guys have pulled all of this information from open sources. And one of your conclusions is that the arms transfers from Russia and Ukraine that you've been able to identify are kind of happening in the open via the government, right? Well, I mean, is that a bias in the data, right? That you are seeing what is believed to be fundamentally illicit activity, and we wouldn't pick up the Victor Boots of the world or the Lords of War in this kind of methodology? Or is it that you are looking at something and missing something else because of the methodology and the data you had access to?
Yeah, so, is this on?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? All right, cool. Yeah, so there's absolutely a bias towards major weapon systems in our data set. By the fact that a tank is considerably larger than a bullet, it's easier to track, it's easier for the government to secure. So we knew going into this that we were going to have an over-representation of sort of the big stuff, tanks, planes, APCs, stuff like that. And we're going to have an under-representation of small arms. So I should say we do have a lot of small arms and ammunition in our data set as well. But so, yeah, it's one of the caveats we make in our report is that we're almost sure that there are small weapons going out of Russia and Ukraine that we don't know about that we're not picking up in our report. So all the stuff that we say about the government has fantastic control should be taken with a grain of salt, as it has fantastic control as it relates to major military hardware.
Right. So, to follow up a little bit, and you guys appropriately caveated a lot of what you said, but that forces us to wonder, right? I mean, what's the heart of the story? If we've got these international shipping companies that are taking contracts to move big, heavy things, and apparently the U.S. Sea Lift Command is also contracting with some of these companies. I mean, why isn't this just commerce, right? I mean, sort of shady commerce that most of us don't look at very often, right? In dealing with large, weapon shipments. But why isn't this just commerce?
That's a perfectly legitimate interpretation of this. I mean, to some extent, it is just commerce. But, the idea is that it's a very specific case study of how commerce works in these areas, particularly sensitive commerce and strategically important commerce. And I'll reiterate what Tom said, is that it seems like arms transfers to countries like Venezuela, which is in our hemisphere and a major strategic antagonist of the United States, arms transfers to the Assad regime by Russia, not Ukraine. Both of these have been heavily subsidized to the point where neither purchaser is really paying for their weapons. So you can't just write that off as sort of business as usual. There has to be some reason why they're doing this. So we think that this is, again, an interesting case study about how private actors are sort of used to carry out state policy.
What, two further questions, just to wrap up back to Syria, which of course is, is closer to my heart than sort of understanding Russian arm exports in general, but is when we look at sort of the patterns of transit between the Ukraine and Syrian ports, do you see patterns in terms of timing? Your data set goes back to 2000. Has there been a surge in this kind of activity in recent years? Is there, obviously we're talking about circumstantial evidence, and I think your point on grain is a really interesting one as an alternative explanation, though I agree that this all looks very suspicious. But what is the, what kind of patterns in that activity specifically can you point your finger at?
Right. So there have been at least 3, if I'm remembering correctly, ships that have been publicly exposed as carrying weapons or military cargo in general from Russia to Tartus in Syria. And the pattern so far has actually been the opposite, in that they're going from northern ports like Kaliningrad or Murmansk or St. Petersburg, not from Oktyabrsk. But the reason why we highlighted Oktyabrsk as people should look here is because if you look at the sheer scale of Russian material support for the Assad regime, just do the mathematics about how many bullets, how many tanks of diesel oil, how many spare parts for tanks, etc., are going to the Assad regime. It logically has to be far more than just those 3 publicly exposed ships. So then if you're saying, where would I go? If I had to pick one place in the entire world where if I stuck a pin, there's a pretty good chance that I'd find a Russian ship with weapons on it in general, it would be Oktyabrsk. So that's kind of why we focused our look there. Though I should say, we also have detected a fair amount of ships going from, not as many as Oktyabrsk, but a fair amount going from St. Petersburg, Kaliningrad, places like that. For example, the dual-use cargo delivered to Assad in 2012 that we mentioned.
Right. That's interesting, though. It helps elucidate some of the Ukrainian foreign minister's comments, saying, there may have been Russian weapons going to Syria, but they didn't come through here, right?
Right.
I think just to close that thought, as I mentioned, the goal of this project, the overarching goal, was to figure out the capabilities and limitations of open source data and helping to answer these types of questions. And I think we've done about what you can do with open source data. We can present a strong circumstantial case. We can provide areas where better resourced groups should potentially focus those resources. But we can't give you smoking guns. And that was never really the goal of the project.
Right. Well, that's fascinating. I'm going to throw it open to the audience. Just a couple of reminders. Please ask them hard questions, but do so politely. Announce yourself, your name, and your affiliation. And please wait for the microphone in the back. So, any questions? Yeah, right here.
Hi, my name is Jacob Manuel. I'm here on behalf of the World Affairs Council. I was curious, you mentioned the question on the biases, kind of emphasizing the major weapon systems and kind of obscuring small arms. I was wondering if that bias could also have obscured dual-use items, whether it be fissile material, chemicals, things like that, or do you feel that you have covered dual-use items fairly well in your report?
We don't have nearly as many dual-use items as we do military cargo, but we actually highlighted a subsection in our report where we said it's not weapons, but gee, it sure is interesting. So, for example, a company that moved Iranian weapons from Cyprus to Syria in 2009 also moves uranium from Russia to France. So that's kind of like the ultimate dual-use item. We had cases of Odessa Network facilitators carrying things that were described as high explosives, which maybe that's weapons, maybe it's not. It certainly goes boom one way or another. But yeah, As we said, a lot of this came from open source reporting, and so there are people who just hang out at ports with cameras snapping pictures when something cool comes in, and they're a lot more likely to do so if it's, you know, a tank or a plane or something like that than it is if, oh, well, some ammonium nitrate or something like that came in.
We also found centrifuges to Gaddafi.
Oh,
Just as a side
actually,
note.
that's kind of the ultimate example. When the AQ Network sent nuclear centrifuges to the Gaddafi regime in Libya in the early 2000s, there were some German companies that are mentioned in our report that I have no idea whether it was witting or unwitting, but it was their ship that it was going on.
Yeah, right here.
Thanks. Dmitry Gorenberg, CNA. I read the report and I found it very interesting. But a lot of the connections between the companies are sort of at the level of various employees that are tied to one and maybe tied to the other. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the reliability, I guess, of that kind of connection. And then maybe in conjunction with that, could you, for those of us who aren't that familiar with it, maybe explain the Palantir methodology and how you use that? Thanks.
So when we talk about dual-listed personnel, and as I had called attention to in my presentation, we were pretty, I'm not asking you to take my word for it necessarily, but we were pretty judicious in what connections we decided to represent in the final report and those that we didn't. We listed connections, and although it was sometimes hard to display in a single graph, between companies that shared personnel, had offices co-located in the same building, and shared a phone number, and participated in the same shipments in the past, and one of them would manage a ship and the other would own the ship. So, without getting too much into the definition of what constitutes a network, I think we were pretty careful about only listing dual-listed personnel that corroborated what we already thought about the relationship between companies. Palantir is an incredibly useful tool in structuring this information and as a presentation tool as well. I don't want to say it's met its match in the complexity of this network because it hasn't. It was incredibly useful for us, but this is the type these are the type of deliberately obscured and super complex connections that are just hard to represent no matter how you do it. But so again, I don't want to just say take my word for it, but I think we've provided a pretty good summation in the report itself of how we link those companies.
Yes, sir.
My name is Alan Mendelson. I'm a lawyer in town. I also happen to teach international maritime law. I noticed in your book that you have a number of names of ship owners that are really cute names, like Beluga Superstition, like Midas, all flagged, of course, in flag of convenience countries. I just wondered if there's any way of determining who are the real owners of these vessels, and whether or not they might be Americans. After all, if the Russians are paying as much as they are to get these weapons out, you can figure that somebody's going to be doing this for a profit. That's question number one. Question number two is, why shouldn't the world do something about these vessel owners who you can't even discover anything about?
So to answer the second part of your question first, I don't know. Why should we? That's not our goal to sit and say that what the policy implications should be. As I said, we're providing this as a resource for you people to make your own judgments about that.
Yeah, but we're definitely going to ask you about the policy.
And I'm just going to keep backstroke. No, but then so you called out a lot of these ships, and so as Farley mentioned, it's pretty common in the shipping industry to have lots of different subsidiary companies, each one of which owns a ship for legal liability reasons. So if my ship runs aground and spills oil, it's only that one company that's responsible that I own, not my entire constellation of ships and companies. But it's really not, I can say this now that I'm on the other side, but it's not that hard to uncover who owns the ship, there's a resource called Oktyabrsk, which is the International Maritime Organization. If a ship is going in the ocean, it has to submit who the owner and operator is, and it's publicly available on this website, Oktyabrsk. And so you can go there, and it does not take a whole lot of analytical insight that if the companies are called Beluga Shipping A, Beluga Shipping B, Beluga Shipping C, there's probably an entity called Beluga Shipping that owns those companies. Right. So we relied on open source records, and yeah.
And one of the ships you mentioned, I'm not going to say which one, was in fact owned by a company that was 51% owned by an American capital group.
American what?
Venture capital, private equity group. We, at risk of introducing bias into a report, we did avoid some of the American names that popped up in our investigation. We've had to be fairly conscientious in terms of avoiding litigation. So, I don't want to completely write off any U.S. role in this network because it's certainly there. We just sort of avoided it for legal reasons.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm Heather Stetton. So I was wondering how the role of the Ukrainian bid in the EU would thwart Russian arms exports and how EU could possibly protect them. And also if you anticipate any turn toward China, since that's has a major arms movement through there.
When we said the Ukrainian bid for EU, the story of Ukraine and of Russia is, are we east or are we west? And so when Ukraine has been making its EU bid, a lot of attention has been called to these sort of murky links between Russia and Ukraine that do not fit EU legal standards. Stuff like, if you remember, during the Orange Revolution, it turns out a bunch of senior Ukrainian leaders had these shady gas pipeline deals, that sort of stuff. So the Russian arms going through Ukraine is just kind of another item in the list of, we're not saying it's wrong. I mean, again, that's not our goal, but a lot of people in the European Union are pretty uncomfortable with it, and they're not, and as far as my understanding of it is they're not going to admit Ukraine until they feel satisfied that things happening in Ukraine meet EU standards of behavior. And in terms of China, we found a lot of Russian weapons going to China, but other than that, it's pretty hard to say.
Yes. Oh, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Tamer Rabbani. I work at a boutique law firm in town. I was really impressed by the report, and I had a couple of questions. Well, really just one overarching theme is trying to kind of figure out the inductive factors you can look at and what you find are the most reliable factors when you look at the when you look at the trends. And you see, there's flags of convenience, there's intermediary stops and subsequent stops for the ships that go there. There's transponders being turned off, there's various types of ships. I was wondering if you could expound on what you found were the most useful factors and the most recurrent factors outside of this network being involved. And a second question would be whether or not you can think of any ostensible reason, given the location of other ports, why grain shipments would originate from Oktyabrsk and not Nikolaev.
So one of obviously the strongest, I don't even know if you can call this an inductive technique, but there's a wealth of information available in the court systems of not only Russia and Ukraine, but there are a great many maritime and admiralty law disputes resolved in U.S. courts. legal exhibits submitted in response or, as part of litigation between shipping companies often contain a wealth of information about ownership structures. Just as one example on, we were trying to figure out the founders of one of these particular companies we were looking at, and we found these 90 pages of incorporation documents submitted as a legal exhibit that were all redacted except for the one page on page 73 where they forgot to redact the name of one of the guys involved and things. So, those are the types of, that's as close as we could get to like a smoking gun to say who owns what company. In terms of inductively reasoning whether there is something illicit going on, it's tough to say. If a company has a particular history of being exposed publicly for these types of shipments, and then we see some of these other things like kind of wonky transponder data, or we know that we have like EXIF image data, which I don't know. It's metadata about a picture taken on a digital camera. It says the time and location when it was taken. So if we have a picture like that of a ship unloading weapons in a particular port and no corresponding transponder record, I think it's safe to say AIS data, the transponder data is imperfect, but if we have that piece of evidence, we have a gap in the transponder coverage, and we have port records from that port that show a bunch of other ships going in and out of there with no error in their AIS. Those are the types of things that made us that piqued our interest, I guess.
In regards to the grain question, I can't think of a whole lot of reasons. Oktyabrsk is a pretty small port. It's actually very small, especially compared to Ukraine has a number of very large, very busy ports. Odessa, Ilyichovsk, Izmail. There are a lot of ports in Ukraine, and it's possible they could be moving grain.
There was certainly grain when we were there.
Yeah,
there
are piles of. I'm not being facetious.
Stored.
They do move grain through that port.
Yeah.
It's very possible they were moving grain.
There were bales of cable. There, culverts and piping, timber. I think maybe there. It's certainly possible.
Hi, Sunny Efron with Human Rights First. First of all, I want to thank you guys because I think this is just really a public service, this report. So congratulations and thanks on behalf of all of us. My question is a variant of Taymor's, and I specifically want to ask about the question of transponder data going silent. First of all, as a matter of law, maritime or national law, is it illegal or a violation to turn off your transponder? And second, could you, in theory, use Palantir or any other tool to query the entire AIS database and only look at disappearing ships? And did you guys ever try to do that, reverse engineer it?
Yeah, yes and no to both questions. It's not illegal on the face of it to turn your transponder off. If it's at the captain's discretion, if he feels that the ship is in a place where revealing the location could bring immediate sort of harm to the ship, then he has that right. I'm speaking specifically about transiting through high piracy areas, things where you don't necessarily want the public location of your ship to be broadcast. You could stretch that argument to Syria, where I'm not going to speculate there. We did notice, though, and again, I think it's worth mentioning on that issue, that the publicly intercepted maritime shipments of Russian weapons to Syria, and I think the one alleged case of Iranian weapons to Syria, all of those vessels turned off their transponder for a period of hours or days while they called at the Syrian port, and then popped back up elsewhere in the Mediterranean. In terms of using Palantir to query transponder data and look for anomalies, we sort of used a workaround for that, in that the International Maritime Organization publishes quarterly lists of all AIS discrepancies. among ships registered. And I think if you're over 300 gross registered tons or something like that, you have to have an IMO number and a transponder. We noted any ships that popped up in our investigation that also popped up in IMO reports. And they actually have a pretty detailed reasoning for why they're listed in that report. And in some cases, you know, this was not critical to the investigation, so we didn't really include it, or we didn't think it was, but a roll-on, roll-off vessel that we know is frequently used for transporting arms is owned by a Turkish gun runner, not necessarily to Syria, but elsewhere, has an AIS discrepancy record noted by the IMO, broadcasting the wrong identification number, making it incredibly hard to track, right? So that's the type of thing that we were able to do.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Judy Dean. I'm with TRAC. You noted at the beginning of your presentation that the model that you sort of came up with of government control is very different from the sort of Victor Bout networks that people have been talking about previously. And so I guess my question is, do you think that this is different because reality has changed, or because this is a network that you just didn't observe here, or what's the explanation?
Yeah, no, in case it wasn't clear, I think the reason is related to big picture political changes in Russia and Ukraine. So I mean, the 90s were a really bad time for Russia and Ukraine in a lot of ways, economically, politically. You have an almost total collapse of political order. You have millions of former Soviet troops and stockpiles that are now essentially out of work, and they're sitting on some very nice stuff. And so you sort of had a perfect storm of factors. Weak government, lots of weapons floating around, lots of poverty, that led to stuff where you could get major weapon systems being sold from former Soviet republics to other countries. So like, for example, there's a guy named Leonid Minin who was based out of Odessa, who, in addition to a bunch of small arms, literally tried to sell an aircraft carrier to Turkey. Or you had the Ukrainian government did sell an aircraft carrier to China, which they then retrofitted, the former Vardyag. You have like advanced Soviet fighter jets being sent off to African conflict zones. So, but that perfect storm of factors is no longer really true today. So the Putin government has made restoration of state control over strategic assets like a core plank of what it wants to do. So there's definitely better guarding of weapons, better control. Obviously, both Russia and Ukraine are thankfully much economically better off today than they were in the 1990s, so there's less of an incentive. Frankly, a lot of the weapons have been sold. A lot of old Soviet stockpiles have been sold now, so it would be new stuff off the line at this point. That said, anytime you have a country that just makes a ton of weapons, it's fair to say some amount is going to go missing, essentially. That's certainly true in the U.S. In terms of small arms, for example, going across the Mexican border. It seems reasonable to say that's probably still the case to some extent in Russia and Ukraine.
I mean, sort of the truism about Soviet-era weapons is that they never really go away. Right? An AK lasts sort of forever. So, you know, I don't think our methodology is necessarily extensible to tracking flows of these weapons that have already entered the sort of illicit or informal channels necessarily.
Yes, in the back over there. Just an aside, if you haven't read C.J. Chiver's book, The Gun, on the history of the AK-47, it's really fascinating. It's worth a read.
Dave Johnson, C4ADS. Can you give an example, perhaps, of where the state reasserted its control over someone who might have sent arms without state control?
Yeah, sure. So I said there are only two examples of major weapon systems being exported, to our knowledge, without state control, and those were actually the first ones in our data set, which happened in the early 2000s when a group of corrupt Russian and Ukrainian military and intelligence people sent X-55 Soviet cruise missiles to Iran in China. This didn't surface for a while until about 2004, but it happened right about 2001. And I don't know if it was the state, but someone certainly was angry that they had done so because they all were killed. Every person who helped participate in that, or either, I think 3 of them were killed, 2 in car crashes, 1 in a car bomb in Africa, and the other one went to prison in Ukraine where he was strangled. So there seemed to be pretty heavy penalties for doing that. And then just more broadly, you can look at sort of the political economy in Russia's, compare oligarchs then in the 90s, Berezovsky, Khodorkovsky, and then who are very politically independent, and then look at oligarchs now who definitely have more of a understanding with the government, its policy preferences.
Are there questions out here? There must be some more questions. So I want to ask you more about, let's come back to some of the Syria questions. And
Sure thing.
we've got you, I mean, this is obviously a pressing issue in the world now. It surprised me as somebody who's not an expert on Russian foreign policy, the degree to which Russia has backed Syria over the last, 2+ years. I'm wondering, for you guys, how do they, as what's represented here, if these are arms transfers, they represent global interest, Russian global interest, and the projection of Russian power to a certain extent. How does Syria play into that? What can we think about the Russian military presence in Syria, Tartus? Is there a possibility that some of this is just going to support the Russian base? We're resupplying, we're doing these kinds of things. And in a broader sense, what does Syria mean in the wider range of Russian strategic partners that it is shipping weapons to? Mostly illicitly, right?
Right. So looking at that, I think the answer comes down to Russia's conception of itself and its role in the world. So in the Russian press, they talk a lot about this political philosophy of like Državnichestvo. It translates as like superpower. We want to be a strong, powerful country. And so you look at places around the world, and the Russian prerogative seems to be finding areas where it can be powerful and trying to do that. And in particular, Russian political leaders have been very open about saying that they strongly disagree with the U.S. idea of how the international system works, in which the Western conception of humanitarian rights is said to be universal and grounds for invasion or sanctions if you violate them. So the Russian perspective on this often is, why is it that your ideals are universal but ours are can be sanctioned for? So I think in Syria you have a perfect storm of that, and that there was a pre-existing relationship from Soviet times where Russia is a big, powerful country with a country that depends on it and is its ally, and then you have the United States looking like it's going to do what it did in Libya, or what it did in Kosovo, or what it did in Iraq, or any of the examples the Russians bring up about how the U.S. is imposing its ideals on the rest of the world. And so you really get your heels dug in, is that this is a country that is a historical ally of ours. It's sort of this like superpower with countries in our orbit, and we're not cool with you invading it in order to impose your ideals on them. So I would, at the best of my knowledge, that's essentially how Russia views the issue.
Are there leverage points that would improve the data here? Right? Are there things that the U.S. government could do from a policy perspective, especially when we're looking at trying to track these ships and ownership records, understand where they are? Are there technological things? We could have transponder black boxes on ships that always record location, and it's just not real time or something like that. So we could go back and at least audit where they've been over time. Are there things that we could do? Could we enforce transparency in these ownership records in a reasonably simple way? I just don't know enough about sort of how these kinds of ships are registered and the technology that is used to track them to understand if there are points there where we can make this easier.
Yeah. Obviously we have no idea about what type of technology exists for government, for the intel community to track these type of things. Yeah. It could be spot on. They could know exactly what's going on, and they certainly weren't willing to share any of that with us. publicly available transponder data records are very much imperfect. But that said, it's also getting a lot better, and it has gotten a lot better over the past 5 years with the creation of Equasis, some of these central clearinghouses for data. I mean, one of the worst, or one of the hardest parts about this is that different stages, like even tracking one ship's journey over the course of a month, may have records. One database may have a network of shore-based receivers that feed into it from certain ports, but they don't have other ports. And then as the ship goes by, it'll just disappear from that database, and you have to pick up the thread in a completely separate place who maintains their own network of shore-based receivers, many of whom are maintained by volunteers and private citizens to track this stuff. So I think that, yeah, I mean, some kind of integration or just a stronger support to this idea of consolidating data in one place would be enormously beneficial. I mean, in terms of the regulatory environment that allows the sort of offshoring and deliberate, obscuring of the ownership, that's a bit outside my sort of capacity to comment on that. I'm certainly not a lawyer, and I don't know what's the right answer there. I mean, obviously it would be useful to people like us if we knew who these people were. But as I said, also, there are a lot of groups working on this stuff. The International Consortium of Investigative Journalists released their giant offshore leaks database recently, which we made great use of. So, good on them, I guess. Hopefully they keep going.
Sure. Yes, sir.
Dmitry Gorenberg, CNA. For reasons that you explained very well, you focused on the ship-borne arms transfers. I'm wondering, is there something that could be done with arms transfers that are done by other means, aircraft, or maybe even railroad into Central Asian states or that sort of thing?
Yeah. So there's a couple. You can sort of narrow. You look at everything that Russia sells and then narrow it down to why is it that so much of it goes on ships. And so the first disqualifying factor is that a lot of this stuff is really, really big, and there's a lot of it. So a 60-ton tank, if you're buying a couple hundred of those, which is the quantities they often sell in, there is no cargo plane in the world that is going to carry that amount of stuff. So physics dictates that it needs to either go on rail or on boat, ship, whatever. But then you look at the customer list, and although Central Asia, as you know, does buy some Russian arms, most of the countries that are really, really big purchasers of Russian and Ukrainian weapons are not geographically close enough for a railroad to be an option. So Venezuela, largest purchaser of Russian ground weapons in the world, separated by the Atlantic Ocean. India, world's largest arm importer in general, and the largest of Russian. I don't think they do any Ukrainian. Way too far away for rail. You just have to go by ship. So you look at the combination of physics and geography means that you just typically end up with a lot of the stuff going by ship. That said, there absolutely are arms that are moved by aircraft. We found some of those. We just didn't include them in our report because we were focusing specifically on maritime ones. But so, for example, if when Indonesia is buying a lot of Sukhoi jet fighters from Russia right now, and they just take off from Vladivostok and keep going until they get to Indonesia, or there have been some small arms transfers to African states that there's a private bush plane. So we are getting into the Victor Boot Lord of War model. Janky bush plane loaded up with guns, dropping down in Sudan and dropping it off. But in general, the vast majority of Russian arms transfers Russian and Ukrainian arms transfers do seem to be going by ship.
My question was, can you use some of the methodologies?
Oh, okay. It's a lot harder. Ships are, the size of some of these cargo ships is pretty huge, and they leave a very large wake, both physical and metaphorical, in that you have to register them with this central clearinghouse, International Maritime Organization, so you can automatically go and look up who it is. They're so huge. They have their names written in giant block letters right across them. there's such large capital investments that you have sort of real companies that own them as opposed to just some guy with a plane. We've looked at using this methodology for air transport and rail transport, but it's just orders of magnitude harder to do.
Yeah, and an additional caveat there is that there is transponder data for planes. Planes, and there are hobbyists, plane spotters who definitely take pictures of these planes as they go in and out of airports. And this was how the I think Washington Post and some other outlets broke the extraordinary rendition story by tracking these planes. It's possible, but I would say that the data is even more imperfect than in the maritime realm. The coverage gaps are much larger, and the coverage gaps are over all of the areas that anyone would be interested in. So maybe in the future.
Sure. Any final questions? All right, final question right here.
Thanks. You'd spoken a little bit about the ships being certified to carry certain items. So there's a certification issue, and I'm wondering if, first, whether or not you just mean whether that's IMO certification to carry hazardous material, and secondly, in terms of other services, external services, did you do any analysis of the insurance companies that were connected to these ships and whether or not the PMSCs were arranging that insurance?
So on your first question on the certification, the dangerous goods certifications are governed by the Safety of Life at Sea Convention, SOLAS, which is, I think, administered by the IMO. I'm not 100% on this. It's another multilateral convention to which most of these parties have signed. I believe all of them have signed. And I don't know, again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know how much leverage there could be there for upping those standards or whatever. And I think a lot of it is also at the discretion of the various sort of registries, either the Russian shipping registry, the maritime shipping registry, Bureau Veritas, Lloyd's. Again, not a lot of central coordination or standardization in that type of thing. We didn't look too hard at the insurance companies. We have in previous investigations, and especially in terms of that, the one I mentioned about looking at conflict goods going out of East Africa. We certainly found that there were EU, Western European insurance agencies, certifying those ships. Possibly another productive area of future research, though, as we weren't necessarily looking for illicit activity, it's a little bit less interesting to say that, okay, so obviously these ships carry insurance from somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, just to interrupt. It's not a thing that differentiates. Like, there's no differentiation. Yeah. So every ship has insurance. You would be absolutely insane to take a $20 million ship out with no insurance. So literally every cargo ship you see is going to be insured somewhere, and probably a lot of the same places. So if you're trying to just the most basic analytical sense say that, like, what makes companies that transport weapons different from companies that don't transport weapons, I'm not sure insurance is like a very productive angle to take on that. Yeah.
This may be a good point to say. That's why we decided to focus on Russia and Ukraine. We started with only Russia, but we found out over the course of our investigation that they basically utilize the same infrastructure and people, which is really what sort of set them apart from other people. So we always kind of were looking for these differentiating criteria.
Hypothetically, though, if it was a Western, hypothetically, if it was a British insurance company that was insuring a Ukrainian ship that was conclusively somehow deemed to be carrying Russian arms to Syria, a government could lean on that insurance company to deny insurance.
And they have. They have.
Right. Right. But that's why I'm laying this out. Right. Yeah. That is a policy avenue that is pointed at through the work that you're
Yeah,
looking
I don't
at.
know. I mean, in terms of actually accomplishing anything against the insurance companies, it's very easy for them to deny any knowledge of the actual cargo or pin it all on the captain who's responsible for certifying the manifests, right?
Sure.
Which, again, has happened in the past. But absolutely, one of the reasons that these shipments, after these shipments, the ones that were publicly exposed from Russia to Assad, one of the ways that they were able to get those ships to divert only temporarily, it turns out, was to get the insurer to yank the coverage. They then sailed back to Russia, got different insurance, and sailed back to Syria.
Yeah, sure. All right, with that, I want to thank everybody for coming. This has been really a fascinating discussion. And the methodology, I'm glad we had the methodology questions, because there's a lot here that I think other folks in town can take forward in different ways, so on a range of different kinds of problems. And you guys really deserve a lot of credit for doing some of the hard work to dig through this data, dig up this data first, and then dig through it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming.
Thank you, guys.